The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, slipping into my inbox without so much as a chime. I almost deleted it on sight, assuming it was another mass-mailed notice from the utility company or a phishing attempt promising lottery winnings. But then my eyes caught on the sender, Harrington and Cole, attorneys at law. The subject line was even colder, formal notice, dinner engagement. I opened it, my pulse quickening as my gaze moved over the clinical, unfeeling sentences. Mr. Arthur Sterling requests the presence of his son, Mr. David Sterling, and his companion, Ms. Ava Peters, for a formal dinner at his private residence. Attendance is expected. Attire, formal. No substitutions or rescheduling permitted. No greeting. No. We look forward to seeing you. Just an order, stripped of warmth, courtesy, or humanity. It read less like an invitation and more like a court summons. I reread the email twice before calling out to David, who was in the kitchen pouring coffee. He appeared in the doorway, mug in hand, and froze when he saw my expression. "It's from Harrington and Cole," I said, holding up my phone like evidence in a trial. "We've been summoned." For a moment, he didn't move. Then his jaw tightened and a flicker of something, fear, maybe, passed over his face. He set his mug down slowly, as if any sudden motion might shatter the fragile air between us. "So it's happening," he said quietly. "He wants to meet you." The way he said he made my stomach clench. Arthur Sterling was a name that existed for me the way distant mountain peaks did, far away, unreachable, shrouded in mist. A legend in the world of finance, he had built his empire from nothing, and then, at the height of his power, vanished into seclusion behind the walls of an estate few had ever seen. People spoke about him in half-whispers, brilliant, ruthless, impossible to please. I had heard the stories. I had also heard about the son he disowned for marrying the wrong woman. Now it was my turn. David took the phone from my hand and scanned the email. His lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't be late," he said, as if lateness were a mortal sin. "And Ava, you'll need to be careful. My father doesn't do small talk, and he doesn't forgive mistakes. He tapped the screen. "This isn't just dinner. It's a test." I wanted to laugh it off, but something in his voice stopped me. This wasn't nervousness. This was dread. I looked again at the email, at its bare, icy words. Somewhere beyond them, beyond the gold-tipped gates and manicured lawns, was a man who had the power to bless or destroy our future. And in exactly 5 days, I was going to sit across from him. David's rules began the moment the email arrived, as if simply reading his father's name had activated some long-buried survival protocol. We were sitting at the small kitchen table, the winter light coming through the blinds in pale, narrow stripes, when he started pacing. His mug of coffee sat untouched, growing cold beside a folded napkin. "My father isn't like other people," he began, running a hand through his hair. "He doesn't do normal dinners. He doesn't do normal anything. Everything is a test with him. And if you fail, there are no second chances." There was an edge in his voice I'd never heard before, brittle and sharp. He stopped pacing long enough to look at me. "He disowned my brother for marrying someone he didn't approve of. Just cut him off. Completely. And he adored my brother. You need to understand what's at stake here, Ava. Our future, our wedding, everything depends on this." He sat back down and leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls might be listening. "We have to manage the impression you make. No risky topics. Talk about art, history, maybe economics if it comes up. Do not, under any circumstances, mention your job at the nonprofit. He thinks charity is a weakness." Something inside me tensed. "You want me to lie?" "Not lie," David said quickly. "Just edit. Shape the truth. And avoid anything about your parents' background. Keep it light. Safe. Impeccable." He pulled out his phone and scrolled until he found a photo. "Wear this," he said, turning the screen toward me. It was a navy blue dress, sleek, modest, expensive looking. "I'll buy it for you. And a scarf," he added, his voice softening just slightly. "The cashmere one. He notices details. Appearances matter to him." He paused, then leaned in as if delivering the most important command of all. "And whatever you do, don't be late. He believes punctuality is a reflection of the mind. If you're late, he'll never forgive you. I mean it, Ava. He's relentless about it." I sat back, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavy. I had met parents before. Awkward dinners, polite questions, forced smiles. But this sounded like preparing for trial in front of a judge who held my entire life in his hands. David's fingers drummed restlessly on the table. I know it sounds extreme, but that's just how he is. This dinner isn't about food. It's about whether he decides you're acceptable. Whether he decides I'm worth keeping in his life. The words hung there between us, stark and unyielding. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his expectations settle on my shoulders. It wasn't just a dinner anymore. It was an exam I couldn't afford to fail. The morning of the dinner felt like the morning of an audition. Not the kind where you get to be yourself, but the kind where every word, every gesture, every flicker of expression has to be curated to please an invisible panel of judges. I sat in front of the mirror, running through David's safe topics, like a student cramming before an exam. Art, history, economics. Not my job. Not my parents. Nothing that might betray the fact that I had been raised in a modest house with peeling paint and a yard full of dandelions instead of roses. Beside me, draped over the back of the chair, was the cashmere scarf. David had handed it to me the night before, with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for heirlooms. He'll notice it, he'd said, smoothing the fabric with his palm. It says something about you before you even open your mouth. I'd wanted to ask what it was supposed to say, but I already knew the answer. Wealth, refinement, belonging. The scarf was beautiful, undeniably so. Soft enough to seem unreal, the color a deep, smoky gray that caught the light like a secret. It wasn't mine, not really. It belonged to the version of me David wanted to present to his father, a woman polished to a shine, stripped of the rough edges and small-town warmth that had shaped her. I pressed the dress he'd chosen, smoothing out every crease, and slipped it on. The fabric felt perfectly, as though it had been tailored for me. It felt like wearing someone else's skin. I looped the scarf around my neck, the weight of it unfamiliar and a little suffocating. David had left hours earlier to prepare at the estate, though I suspected he simply couldn't bear the thought of arriving together in case I broke some unspoken rule on the way. Alone in the apartment, I walked from mirror to mirror, checking myself from every angle, rehearsing a smile that was warm but not too familiar, polite but not cold. By noon, my stomach was in knots. I tried to eat, but the idea of food made me queasy. Instead, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, going over imaginary conversations in my head. I could discuss the Impressionists, the fall of empires, the principles of supply and demand, but every time I practiced, my voice felt like it belonged to someone else. The scarf lay against my collarbone, soft and silent, a constant reminder of the role I was meant to play. It was supposed to be armor, a signal that I belonged in Arthur Sterling's world. But as I sat there, watching the winter light fade through the blinds, it felt less like armor and more like a leash. In just a few hours, I would find out whether it was enough to save me. The train ride out of the city felt shorter than it should have, as if the universe had decided to hurry me toward whatever fate was waiting behind Arthur Sterling's gates. When the brakes screeched and the doors slid open, I stepped onto the platform with my bag slung over my shoulder, the winter air sharp enough to sting my cheeks. David had insisted I take a taxi from the station, but the thought of sitting in a stranger's car, trapped with my own nerves, made my skin crawl. I needed air. I needed movement. The estate was only a mile away. A walk, I told myself, would steady me. The streets here were nothing like the ones I knew. They were wide and eerily quiet, lined with manicured hedges so tall they seemed to block out the sky. Behind them, I caught glimpses of sprawling mansions, stone facades, arched windows, wrought iron balconies, each one a declaration of wealth so confident it didn't need to speak above a whisper. My sensible heels clicked against the pristine pavement, the sound too loud in the hush. I kept expecting someone to step out and tell me I didn't belong here, to escort me back to the train station where people like me were supposed to stay. Every so often, I checked my watch. I had enough time, but only just. The scarf sat snug against my neck, soft and warm, the one familiar comfort in a place where everything else felt foreign. I passed a row of bare-limbed oak trees, their branches clawing at the pale winter sky, and tried to picture the kind of life lived behind these gates. Cocktail parties. Polo matches. Rooms so large they could swallow my entire apartment. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, but beneath it was something else, order, money, control. Even the grass on the lawns I passed seemed to have been trimmed with surgical precision. The weight of it pressed against me, invisible but suffocating, a reminder that I was walking into a world built on rules I didn't know and couldn't see. I pulled the scarf a little tighter, as if it might shield me from that invisible judgment. Ahead, the road curved gently, the high hedges closing in on either side. Somewhere beyond them was Arthur Sterling's estate, waiting like a final exam I hadn't studied for. I breathed in the cold air and kept walking, each step carrying me further from the safety of the station and deeper into the territory of a man whose opinion could change the course of my life. The silence of the neighborhood followed me, unbroken, as if even the wind had learned to hold its breath here. It was just past 4 when I saw him. The road curved toward a small green, no bigger than a city block, tucked neatly between 2 enormous estates. In the center stood a single park bench, weathered and gray against the perfect symmetry of the trimmed hedges and ornamental trees. The man sitting there looked like he had been dropped in from another world entirely. His jacket was thin and frayed, the kind of thing you'd find at the back of a thrift store bin. His trousers were worn nearly white at the knees, his shoes cracked and scuffed. He sat hunched against the wind, hands buried deep in his pockets, his head bent low. I slowed without meaning to. The cold was sharp today, the kind that found its way through seams and sleeves, and he was no match for it. His shoulders trembled in tiny, constant shivers. I glanced at my watch. 15 minutes to make it to the estate gates. David's voice echoed in my mind. Don't be late, don't be late, don't be late. This meeting is everything. I told myself I should keep going. I didn't have time for this. It wasn't my responsibility. Someone else would help him, surely. Someone with the luxury of time, someone not on their way to be judged by a man who might decide their entire future over a single impression. But as I drew level with the bench, I caught a glimpse of his face. It was pale, lined with the kind of creases carved by years of weather and worry. His eyes, downcast though they were, seemed tired. Not just physically tired, but emptied, as if life itself had been slowly poured out of him. I kept walking 2, 3 more steps, my heart thudding a little faster. My grandmother's voice rose up in my head, as clear as if she were walking beside me. The measure of your character, my dear, is how you treat someone who can do nothing for you. I stopped. The scarf around my neck was warm, impossibly soft. The sandwich in my bag was meant to settle my stomach before the dinner. Both, I realized, could mean more to him than they did to me. I turned back toward the bench. The man didn't look up until I was standing in front of him, blocking the wind. His eyes were a startling blue, clear, intelligent, and utterly out of place in the shabbiness around them. I hesitated, the weight of the minutes ticking away in my mind, but something in his gaze held me there, anchored me to the spot. For a moment, the estate, the dinner, the rules, all of it, seemed very far away. Up close, he looked even older than I'd thought, his skin paper-thin and weathered, his cheeks hollow, his hands pale and trembling where they clutched at the edges of his jacket. The wind tugged at the thin fabric, and I could almost feel the cold seeping into his bones. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice soft, careful not to startle him. He lifted his head and met my eyes. That blue, startling, sharp, held me for a moment. "Just a bit cold," he said, his voice low and rough, as if it hadn't been used much lately. "And I seem to have missed the lunch service at the shelter." I felt the faintest pinch of guilt in my chest. In my bag was the sandwich I'd packed for the train, turkey and Swiss on whole wheat, nothing fancy, but it was the only food I had with me. David's voice flared in my mind again, crisp and scolding. "This isn't a game, Ava. Every detail matters." I pulled the sandwich out before I could talk myself out of it. "It's not much," I said, holding it out to him. "But it's yours if you want it." He looked at it, then at me, something unreadable flickering across his face. He accepted it with both hands, almost ceremoniously. "Thank you," he said after a moment. "That is very kind." A gust of wind swept between us, catching the scarf at my neck and brushing it against my cheek. I hesitated. The cashmere was warm, soft, absurdly expensive. It was supposed to be part of my armor tonight, proof that I belonged in Arthur Sterling's world. He looked at it, then at me, something unreadable flickering across his face. He accepted it with both hands, almost ceremoniously. "Thank you," he said after a moment. That is very kind. A gust of wind swept between us, catching the scarf at my neck and brushing it against my cheek. I hesitated. The cashmere was warm, soft, absurdly expensive. It was supposed to be part of my armor tonight, proof that I belonged in Arthur Sterling's world. But here, now, it felt like a ridiculous indulgence. He was shivering so hard I could hear the faint click of his teeth. I unwound it slowly, the fabric whispering against my skin, and draped it over his shoulders. "And this?" I said. "You need it more than I do." He reached up, fingers brushing the scarf as though testing its reality. His eyes came back to mine, and this time they seemed to look straight through me. "You are a very kind woman," he said quietly, and there was a weight in his tone I couldn't quite name. For a beat, neither of us moved. Then I glanced at my watch and felt the jolt of panic. Minutes had slipped away, and I was already cutting it close. "I should go," I murmured, stepping back. He nodded once, still watching me, and as I hurried away, the memory of his gaze followed me, steady, knowing, as if he'd seen something in me that I hadn't yet seen myself. By the time I turned the corner and left the little green behind, the cold air felt sharper, the light thinner. I checked my watch and my stomach dropped. 5:12. Dinner was at 5. Even if I ran, I'd be late. The realization landed heavy, a dull weight in my chest. David's voice played on a loop in my head, each word laced with that tense, urgent edge he'd had all week. "Don't be late, Ava. He'll never forgive you. He'll think you're disorganized. Unworthy." I quickened my pace, the soft soles of my shoes whispering against the immaculate sidewalk. The scarf was gone, my neck bare to the wind, and with every step the absence of it reminded me what I'd just done. I could still see the old man's fingers curled around the fabric, his shoulders relaxing beneath its warmth. It had been the right choice. I knew that. But the right choice didn't matter in the world I was walking toward. In that world, appearances were everything, and I just walked away from mine. The houses loomed taller now, their hedges thicker, their gates more elaborate, intricate scrolls of iron, crests I didn't recognize, gold leaf catching the fading light. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. I tried to imagine my arrival, hair slightly windblown, cheeks flushed from the cold, a faint sheen of sweat at my hairline. No scarf. Late. I could picture David's face, the sharp intake of breath before the scolding, the tight-lipped panic in front of his father. The more I thought about it, the faster I walked, until I was nearly running, my heels sinking into patches of soft earth at the edges of the path. My pulse thudded in my ears, matching the rhythm of my steps. Somewhere ahead, hidden by the curve of the road and the towering oaks, was the estate, those wrought iron gates David had described in reverent tones, the kind that swung open only for the chosen few. In a few minutes, I'd be standing there, announcing myself into an intercom, hoping the gates would open at all. I clutched my bag tighter and tried to quiet the voice in my head that kept repeating the same truth. It didn't matter how well I smiled, how perfectly I held my fork, or how fluently I spoke about the Impressionists. I had already failed his first and most important rule. I was late. And in David's world, lateness was a sin you couldn't atone for. The gates were even more imposing up close, two black iron monoliths crowned with a gleaming gold S that caught the last scraps of daylight. I pressed the intercom button, my voice tight as I gave my name. A pause, long enough to feel like judgment, and then the buzz and slow swing of metal. The driveway wound upward through a tunnel of ancient oaks, the branches arching overhead like a cathedral ceiling. By the time the mansion came into view, a sprawling stone edifice with dark windows and a grand staircase, I was breathless, my calves burning. David was pacing at the top of the steps, phone in hand. The moment he saw me, he shoved it into his pocket and strode forward, his expression hard enough to stop me mid-step. 17 minutes late, he hissed as soon as I reached him, his grip closing around my arm. 17. I told you. I know. I cut in, still catching my breath. I'm sorry, His gaze swept down my figure, stopping abruptly at my bare neck. His eyes narrowed. Where's the scarf? I hesitated. I gave it to. You what? His voice climbed a register, sharp enough to make me glance toward the front doors, half expecting someone to hear. There was a man, I said, keeping my voice low. On a bench. He was cold. David's face twisted, part disbelief, part fury. You gave a $700 scarf to a homeless man? On your way here? Before meeting my father? He shook his head, his grip tightening. Do you have any idea what's at stake tonight? This isn't one of your charity projects, Ava. This is my father. This is the rest of our lives. The words landed like small, sharp blows. I wanted to tell him it had mattered, that the man had needed warmth more than I needed an accessory, but the look in David's eyes told me there was no space for that here. His voice dropped again, but the anger in it had only sharpened. First you're late, now you show up without the one thing that made you look the part. What do you think he's going to see when you walk in there? Someone who belongs in his world, or someone who can't follow the simplest instructions? Something inside me went still. I realized he wasn't just angry, he was afraid. Not for me, for himself. And in that moment, I understood exactly how much of this dinner was about his own standing, his own inheritance, and how little of it had to do with us as a couple. I straightened my shoulders, meeting his glare without flinching. Then let's get it over with, I said quietly. His jaw tightened, but he turned toward the massive oak doors. The air between us was colder than the wind. The oak doors swung open with a slow, deliberate weight, revealing a man so tall and thin he seemed almost etched from shadow. His black and white uniform was immaculate, his expression unreadable, his voice dry as paper. Mr. Sterling will see you now. David's grip on my arm tightened for a fraction of a second before he let go, straightening his tie as if to armor himself. I followed him inside, the air immediately cooler, drier, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and something older, dust, perhaps, or history too proud to be erased. The foyer was vast enough to swallow my entire apartment. Black and white marble tiles stretched in a perfect geometric grid beneath a ceiling so high it felt like its own sky. Along the walls, oil portraits stared down at us, men and women painted in rich, dark tones, each one wearing the kind of expression that suggested they'd never had to ask permission for anything in their lives. Our footsteps echoed, sharp and unsoftened, as the butler led us forward. David walked with a rigid precision, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed straight ahead. I tried to mirror his composure, but my eyes kept drifting, to the gilded frames, the heavy velvet drapes, the silent chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations. The hallway seemed endless, the kind of corridor you might see in a museum or an old palace, where every object had been placed for show rather than use. I realized, with a small twist in my stomach, that the house did not feel like a home. It felt like a monument, to power, to legacy, to the man we were about to meet. We stopped before a pair of towering dark wood doors. The butler paused, one gloved hand on the polished brass handle. Mr. Sterling is in the main dining room, he announced, as though presenting a verdict. I drew in a slow breath, feeling the soft give of my dress at the waist, the faint chill against my bare neck where the scarf had once been. Somewhere on the other side of those doors sat a man whose opinion could alter the trajectory of my life in a single evening. David's voice was a whisper at my ear. Let me do the talking. Smile. Be polite. Don't mention. But I wasn't listening anymore. My pulse had slowed into a heavy, deliberate beat, each one a reminder that I had already made my choice on that park bench. Whether it would damn me or save me, I didn't know. The butler pushed the doors open, and the sound of their hinges was like the slow draw of a curtain before the first act of a play. Whatever role I was meant to play here, I was already on stage. The dining room was a cavern of shadowed grandeur, lit only by the pale winter light spilling through tall, arched windows. A mahogany table, long enough to host a minor royal court, stretched from one end of the room to the other. Its dark surface gleamed like still water, empty but for a single place setting at the far end. Seated there, framed by the vaulted ceiling and the unlit chandelier above, was a solitary figure. At first, my mind refused to connect what my eyes were telling me. The distance between us was too great, the setting too surreal. But then he moved, lifting a hand to adjust something draped over his shoulders, and my stomach dropped straight through the polished floor. The scarf. My scarf. The same smoky gray cashmere that had been around my neck barely an hour ago now rested against the threadbare collar of his jacket. And beneath it, the face, lined, weathered, but unmistakable, was the same one I'd seen hunched on a park bench, shivering in the cold. My steps faltered, my breath catching in my throat. The room, the portraits on the walls, even the sound of David's whisper beside me, all of it receded until there was only that clear, intelligent blue gaze meeting mine across the impossible distance. David followed my stare, and I felt the exact moment the recognition hit him. His body went rigid, his breath coming in a sharp, startled intake. "Father?" The word escaped as more of a gasp than a greeting, disbelief sharpening it to a point. "What? What are you wearing? Are you?" Arthur Sterling didn't answer him. His eyes never left mine, his mouth curving into the faintest, warmest smile, as if the grandeur of the room, the icy formality of the occasion, and the layers of expectation between us had all been stripped away in that instant. I couldn't move. My mind spun uselessly, trying to reconcile the man in the seat of power with the one who had accepted my sandwich with quiet dignity, who had thanked me like I'd given him something far more valuable than bread and cheese. Beside me, David's shock was curdling into something darker. His grip on my arm was almost imperceptible but tense, as though he could physically steer me away from the truth hanging in the air between us. Arthur's voice, when it came, was exactly as I remembered it, low, a little rough, carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "Welcome, Ava," he said. "Please come in. I believe we've already met." And just like that, the walls of David's carefully constructed test collapsed, leaving me standing in the middle of a very different one I hadn't realized I had already passed. Arthur's smile deepened, the kind that felt like it belonged to a private joke only he and I understood. He gestured toward the chair nearest to him, the seat of honor at that endless table. "I must apologize for my appearance earlier today," he said, his voice carrying easily across the polished expanse between us. "An old and, I admit, rather eccentric habit of mine. I like to step away from my own walls now and then. See the world as it truly is. It's remarkable what you learn about people when they think you have nothing to offer them." David was still standing stiffly beside me, as if his shoes had been nailed to the floor. His color had drained to an almost sallow pallor. You were sitting on a park bench?" he stammered. Like a homeless man?" Arthur's eyes flicked to his son, a glint of steel in their blue depths. "Yes, David. Precisely like that. I've found it to be a far more reliable test of character than watching someone handle fine china or quote the classics." I felt David shift beside me, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a near imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. Arthur turned his attention back to me. "You were late," he said, though there was no censure in his tone, only observation. "You knew you had somewhere important to be, someone important to meet. And yet you stopped." His gaze lingered on the scarf at his shoulders. "You offered food you could not easily replace. Warmth you would miss on a cold day." The weight of the room seemed to tilt toward me, the portraits watching, the air thick with the unspoken. Arthur's smile returned, softer now. "You passed my test, Ava. And more importantly, you passed it without knowing there was a test at all." David's breath came out in a sharp, almost audible exhale, and I could feel the heat of his humiliation radiating off him. He had spent a week drilling me on the importance of punctuality, appearances, the right conversational fodder, and I had failed all of it. Yet here, in the seat of judgment he feared most, I had somehow succeeded. Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands loosely on the table. "Now," he said, "why don't you sit down, and we can have a proper conversation? There is much I'd like to know about you." It wasn't just an invitation, it was a declaration. And in that moment, I understood that whatever game David had been playing, the rules had just changed entirely. Arthur's gaze settled on me with the weight of someone who had been watching longer than I realized. He reached for his water glass, took a measured sip, and then set it down with deliberate care, as though he were arranging his thoughts in the same precise way he arranged his table. "You see, Ava," he began, his voice even, but carrying an undercurrent of something sharper. "Most people believe wealth is the ultimate measure. Status. Influence. How well you navigate a conversation about the stock market or a painting in the Louvre." His eyes flicked, briefly, to David before returning to me. "But those are the easiest performances in the world. Anyone can be taught the right words, the right fork, the right posture." He leaned back, the cashmere scarf shifting on his shoulders. "What can't be taught, what can't be faked, is how you treat someone who can do nothing for you. That's the currency I deal in. The only one worth anything." The word sank into me like warm water into cold skin. I thought of the bench, the sandwich, the way his hands had closed around it like something fragile. I thought of David's voice in my ear all week, crisp and anxious, telling me not to stray from the script. "You failed your fiancé's test," Arthur went on, his tone now threaded with the faintest edge of amusement. "You were late. You arrived without the one accessory chosen to make you look respectable." His eyes lit with quiet satisfaction. "And in doing so, you passed mine with flying colors." I didn't know what to say. Praise from this man felt different than praise from anyone else. It carried the sense that it had been earned, weighed, and deemed worthy. David shifted beside me, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. I could feel his discomfort like static in the air, but Arthur ignored it entirely. "I've sat in this room with heirs of dynasties," he continued. "Young men and women groomed from birth to fit a certain mold. Perfect suits, perfect smiles, perfect manners. And when they thought no one important was looking, I saw who they really were, dismissive, impatient, sometimes cruel." He shook his head. "You can't build anything lasting on that. Not a company. Not a family." Arthur's expression softened again, and for a moment, the intimidating billionaire was replaced by the man on the bench, the one who had accepted my small offerings with such gravity. "You stopped," he said simply. "And that, Ava, tells me everything I need to know." The room was utterly still, as though even the walls were holding their breath. And in that silence, I felt something shift, not just in the balance between Arthur and me, but in the fault line that had quietly opened between David and me the moment I'd made that choice on the park bench. Arthur rose from his chair with an ease that belied his age, and gestured to the seat immediately to his right. The place setting there gleamed, polished silver, crystal glassware, the linen napkin folded into a perfect triangle. "Here, Ava," he said, his voice warm, but leaving no room for argument. "Sit beside me." It felt strange to walk the long length of the table alone, my heels tapping softly against the polished floor, while David remained rooted at my side of the room. He hesitated, then took a seat several chairs away, as though unsure whether he was meant to be part of this conversation at all. The butler appeared with the first course, a delicate soup in porcelain bowls, and slipped away without a sound. Arthur didn't even glance at David. His attention was wholly on me. "Tell me," he said, breaking a piece of bread with careful precision, "what you do when you're not being summoned to intimidating dinners by strange old men." I hesitated only for a heartbeat before answering. David's earlier warnings about avoiding any mention of my non-profit work echoed faintly, but they felt far away now, irrelevant. "I work with an inner-city youth program," I said. "We're building a community garden right now. It's slow going, but worth it." Arthur's eyes sharpened with interest. "A garden," he repeated. "Something that grows. Something that feeds people. I like that." He asked questions, pointed, thoughtful ones, not the kind meant to trap, but to draw out. How did we involve the children? Where did the funding come from? What challenges did we face? I answered honestly, my voice growing steadier with each exchange. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally, his expression intent. Between courses, he shifted the conversation to books, to art, to my childhood. I spoke about my parents, a teacher and a nurse, and the small, love-filled home they'd made despite never having much money. "They sound like good people," Arthur said, and there was a quiet sincerity in his tone that made my throat tighten. "The kind who understand that wealth isn't measured in accounts or properties, but in how you treat the people around you." I smiled, and for the first time that evening, it was entirely uncalculated. David sat in silence, his fork moving aimlessly through his food, his eyes fixed on his plate. Arthur didn't acknowledge him, not out of cruelty, but as if he were simply irrelevant to the conversation at hand. By the time dessert arrived, a light, fragrant custard, I realized the knots in my stomach had loosened. The man beside me was still formidable, still someone who could change my life with a word, but he wasn't the caricature of power I'd been bracing for. He was curious, sharp, and, though he'd never say it outright, kind. And all of that, I understood, was deliberate. The dinner wasn't about testing my polish or manners. It was about showing me, in the clearest way possible, exactly whose test I had really passed. Arthur set his fork down and rested his elbows lightly on the table, the candlelight catching in his eyes. "You know," he said, "people often speak about themselves as if they're listing credentials on a resume. But I'd like to know the parts you wouldn't think to write down. Who made you who you are?" The question caught me off guard. It was not the kind of thing you could answer with a rehearsed anecdote. Still, I found myself leaning in, my voice low but steady. "My parents," I said. "My father teaches high school history. My mother's a nurse. They've never had much money, but they've always had enough. Enough to give me books. Enough to sit with me at the table every night and listen when I spoke. Enough to make me feel safe." Arthur nodded slowly, as if each word was a stone he was turning over in his hand. "And the nonprofit?" I hesitated only for a second, then let the truth come out. "I work with kids who don't get many chances. Some of them don't even have a safe place to go after school. We try to give them that, and teach them to grow food, to take care of something living. It's small, but it matters." There was no flicker of disdain in his eyes, no trace of the judgment David had so feared. If anything, Arthur looked almost pleased. "It matters a great deal," he said. "Anyone can multiply money. Very few can multiply dignity." I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, though I was suddenly aware of David's stillness across the table. His eyes were fixed on his plate, the tight line of his mouth unreadable. Arthur poured himself a little more wine and regarded me over the rim of his glass. "Your parents," he said, "sound like the sort of people I'd enjoy meeting. They've given you something rare, Ava. A foundation that doesn't crack under pressure. That's more valuable than any inheritance." The warmth in his voice made my chest tighten. It was the kind of acknowledgement you didn't realize you'd been longing for until it was given. "I don't think they've ever thought of themselves as remarkable," I admitted. "They just try to do the right thing." Arthur smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested he'd already made up his mind about me. "That's exactly why they are." For a moment, the grand dining room felt smaller, less like a hall of judgment and more like a place where conversation could live. But the shift in atmosphere was one-sided. I could still feel David's discomfort radiating from down the table. Arthur didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he noticed and simply didn't care. His attention was still fixed on me, as though, for this evening at least, I was the only one at the table worth knowing. When the plates from the main course had been cleared, and the butler retreated in that silent way of his, Arthur reached to the back of his chair. His hand emerged holding a familiar sweep of smoky gray, my scarf, folded with deliberate care, as if it were something far more precious than a strip of cashmere. "I believe this is yours," he said, offering it across the narrow space between us. His voice had softened, losing the formality it carried at the start of the evening. "It kept me warm when I needed it most. That is not something one forgets." For a moment, I just looked at it, my fingers curling against my lap. I'd resigned myself to never seeing it again. When I draped it over his shoulders on that park bench, the gesture had been final, an act with no expectation of return. Now, in the grandest dining room I'd ever sat in, he was placing it back into my hands. I reached for it, my fingertips brushing his knuckles. The brief contact carried more than politeness. It was acknowledgement, quiet and unmistakable. "I'm glad it helped," I said, my voice lower than I intended. Arthur gave a single nod, his gaze unwavering. "It did. More than you realize." The scarf pulled in my lap, familiar, and yet somehow changed. It wasn't just the same accessory David had insisted I wear to impress him. It was layered now with something richer, a shared moment, a small act of kindness that had crossed the invisible walls between strangers. "You didn't have to give it," Arthur said, leaning back slightly. "That is why it matters. Most people will only part with something if they know they'll be thanked, remembered, or rewarded. You gave without any of that in mind." I thought of the way he looked up at me on the bench, those sharp blue eyes taking my measure even then. I'd assumed it was simple gratitude. Now I realized it had been recognition. "I didn't think I'd see it again," I admitted, smoothing the fabric between my fingers. "That," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting, "is precisely why you have." I draped it back around my neck, and for a moment it felt like armor, not the kind David had wanted me to wear, but the kind that came from being truly seen and found worthy. Across the table, David's posture stiffened. He was watching, though Arthur never once turned toward him. The conversation was ours alone. The scarf stayed with me for the rest of the evening, warm against my skin, carrying the quiet certainty that I had already crossed whatever invisible threshold Arthur Sterling set for those he allowed into his life. And in that certainty, the air between us settled into something far more enduring than approval. It felt almost like family. When the last plate had been cleared and the wine glasses stood empty, Arthur rose from his chair with a kind of quiet authority that needed no announcement. He walked with us to the great doors, his steps measured, the cashmere scarf still draped around my neck like an unspoken seal. David straightened as we reached the threshold, his shoulders tense, as though bracing for the final judgment. Arthur stopped, his gaze shifting between the two of us before fixing on his son. "You have a remarkable woman here, David," he said, his tone even but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Do not make the mistake of underestimating her or her values ever again." David's throat moved, but no words came. Arthur went on, his voice like a scalpel, precise, unflinching. "Your place in my company and in my life is secure. But not because of your merit tonight. Because of hers. Remember that." The statement landed with a thud, as though he'd set a ledger down on the table and closed it for good. David's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward me in a way that was equal parts acknowledgement and something else, something closer to shame. Arthur turned to me then, the steel in his expression softening. "You've shown me exactly what I've been looking for, Ava. Not polish, not pedigree, but the rare ability to see a person for what they are and treat them with dignity, regardless of what they can offer in return." I didn't know how to respond. Gratitude felt too small a word, and yet it was all I had. "Thank you," I said quietly. He inclined his head, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. "It's I who should be thanking you. You've reminded me there are still people worth trusting." The butler appeared, opening the massive door to the night air. Arthur stepped back, but not before giving David one last look, cool, unblinking. "Go home," he said, "and be the man she deserves." We stepped out into the cold, the heavy door closing behind us with a sound that echoed in my chest. The drive down the long, oak-lined path was silent, save for the crunch of gravel underfoot until we reached the car. David slid into the driver's seat without a word, but I could feel the storm gathering inside him. As I settled into my seat, scarf warm around my neck, I knew something fundamental had shifted. Tonight had been about more than approval or inheritance. Arthur had made his verdict clear, and it wasn't just about who belonged in his family. It was about who, in his eyes, had already earned their place. The drive back was a stretch of silence, so thick it felt like its own presence in the car. The night outside slid past in blurred streaks of streetlights and shadow, the hum of the tires the only sound between us. David kept both hands locked on the wheel, his shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on the empty road ahead, as though looking anywhere else might undo him. I didn't speak. I could still feel Arthur's words echoing in my head, their weight heavy but clean. "Your place is secure because of hers." It had been both a verdict and a mirror, showing the truth neither of us had been willing to look at before tonight. We were almost halfway home when David's grip slackened. His breathing hitched, just once, but enough for me to hear it over the steady hum of the engine. He blinked hard, swallowed, then let out a quiet, unsteady sound, half sigh, half sob. "I'm sorry," he said at last. The words were low, almost lost to the road noise, but they carried the rawness of something long overdue. "Not just for tonight. For everything. For the past 2 years." He didn't look at me. His gaze stayed forward, his voice trembling in places. "I've been so obsessed with earning his approval that I tried to make you into someone else. I thought if you looked right, spoke right, acted right, it would mean I was enough. That we were enough." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't see that you were already more than enough. And I made you feel like you weren't." The admission sat between us, fragile, like something that could break if I moved too quickly. "I was afraid," he went on. "Afraid he'd reject me like he did my brother. Afraid I'd lose everything I thought mattered. But tonight, seeing him with you, I realized I've been measuring myself by the wrong standards. And the truth is," his voice caught, and he forced the next words out, "you weren't the one being tested tonight. I was." For a while, I just listened, my hands folded in my lap. He wasn't the same man who had stood on those stone steps, eyes hard with fear disguised as anger. This David was smaller somehow, stripped of his careful armor, and it made him look startlingly young. When we finally pulled into our street, the silence that settled was different from before, less a wall, more a space. We walked up to our apartment without another word, but when he closed the door behind us, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Not pride, not performance, just truth. And in that truth, there was the faintest outline of a man who might finally be ready to change. The day we married was nothing like the one David had once imagined. There was no country club, no guest list swollen with people whose names opened doors. Instead, there was my parents' backyard, bright with early summer sunlight and the hum of bees drifting between wildflowers. White folding chairs lined the grass, and a trellis my father had built stood at the end of the aisle, draped in my mother's climbing roses. Arthur sat in the front row, the cashmere scarf settled around his shoulders like a medal of honor. It looked almost out of place in the warmth, but he wore it with quiet pride, his long frame relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. Every so often, his eyes met mine, and a small, knowing smile would pass between us. David stood at the altar, looking different too, not in his suit, but in himself. The tension that had once lived in his posture was gone, replaced by something steadier. When I reached him, he took my hands as though the entire world had narrowed to just that moment. The ceremony was simple. We spoke vows we'd written ourselves, words shaped not by tradition or expectation, but by the years that had brought us here, the mistakes, the reckonings, the small acts of grace that had changed everything. When David promised to see me as I was, not as he thought I should be, I felt the truth in it. From the corner of my vision, I saw Arthur listening, the scarf a soft gray slash against his dark suit, the faintest satisfaction in his expression. It struck me then how strange it was that I had once thought the scarf's worth was in its price, and the image it projected. Now it meant something entirely different. It was proof of a choice I'd made without thinking, a choice that had altered the shape of my life. After we kissed, and the guests rose in applause, the reception unfolded in a blur of clinking glasses and laughter spilling across the lawn. Arthur found me at the edge of the crowd, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You've done well, Ava," he said, his voice low but certain. "And not just today." I smiled, though words felt unnecessary. He knew I understood. Later, when the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I caught sight of him across the yard, the scarf still in place. I realized then that the real test, the only test that mattered, hadn't been about impressing anyone, least of all him. It had been about who I was when no one was watching. And all it had taken to pass it was a sandwich, a scarf, and the simple decision to stop for a stranger on a park bench.